Let's start by reading verses 1 through 4. These are only 4 verses, but they're they're deep. Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. I hadn't noticed it before, but that's actually all one sentence.
Mm-hmm.
I guess he anticipates the German writers. So this is probably one of the most difficult sections of Hebrews to translate, including, for one reason, he uses 2 words that don't exist in Greek, or don't exist anywhere, in fact. But also, from the viewpoint of many interpreters, some of the phrases don't make any sense. The first question, as always, is how does this relate to anything previously, and especially the previous chapter?
Well, it's referring to the witnesses who are in the previous chapter. So therefore is kind of a transition from the litany of witnesses or of the faith, heroes of the faith, to how are we going to get there? Therefore, what do we need to do to become one of the faithful in heaven?
Mm-hmm.
Cheered on by those named and many others who aren't named.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jesus was the last of the, it doesn't end with the witnesses or the heroes of the faith. Well, Jesus is the last of them, and yet the leader.
Right. Uh-huh. Jesus is the end of the line, but the greatest and most definitive example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he, the source of our faith, and the one who brings it to completion.
Mm-hmm.
So we're to persevere and keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus.
Chapter 11, verse 40 ends with, since God had foreseen something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are clear linkages to that sentence. So apart from us becomes we, or we ourselves, in verse 1 of chapter 12. In verse 39, all these, and then the from us, becomes the cloud of witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
The all these attested by their faith is the witnesses. So they're juxtaposed to us in chapter 11 and to we in chapter 12. So that points to continuity and discontinuity. Like them, we're strangers and aliens on the earth. On the other hand, they did not receive what had been promised, but saw it and greeted it from afar. Whereas we don't need to greet it from afar. We only need to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus.
And the saints were an example of continuing on despite what they were going through, continuing to believe.
Mm-hmm.
the perseverance.
Then there's also a link to chapter 10, verse 36. For you have need of endurance,
Mm-hmm.
so that you may do the will of God and receive what is promised. And so now he is developing the theme of endurance. And we also move from the attested witnesses to ourselves. So they testified to the faith, and we can too. And since chapter 12 begins with therefore, that's the clear linkage to the previous chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And it suggests that the heroes of the Old Testament are brought into our own time as examples and supporters.
Mm-hmm. Cheering us on, it says, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
There was one section where great joy in heaven when one comes back to the faith. I remember where that was.
I think it's in Luke, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's in the Gospels. I'm not sure that would be something the author would say.
Yeah, it's true.
Actually, we'll get to it later, but Healy almost, in the final thing, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood.
Yeah.
Healy almost seems to think that he's saying that jokingly, but it's hard to imagine him saying anything jokingly. He doesn't exactly seem like he's a lighthearted sort of fellow.
No, and in those days they were shedding blood.
Right, no, that's true. They were shedding
Christians
blood.
were shedding blood.
Yeah, yeah, actually,
So that was something that was right there in their lives.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something actually that I wanted to talk about tonight. I'm my suspicion is we're going to have martyrs here over the next however many years, um, for Christians who refuse to engage in idolatry
Mm-hmm.
and bow down to the great dictator. I mean, he's already promised to eliminate the vermin and the enemy within. So I think he will try to eliminate the vermin and the enemy within.
There's a piece that goes to that. Our sufferings have great value for training us in holiness, and they're thus not a reason for discouragement. So we're going to go through a time of non-discouragement here.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that this this section really provides a sort of guidebook for those who continue to uphold the faith.
Mm-hmm.
This and I've also been reading Psalm 27, which is, you know, sort of very inspirational in that way. Um, so yeah, um, but so we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. That is a really beautiful image. The cloud is also the same word used to describe a throng or a large number of people, or a host, as in the heavenly host.
Mm-hmm.
So a great number of people in their unity. So so what would we call that great cloud of witnesses?
Well, they're saints.
The saints, or the communion of saints.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is one of the verses that in Catholicism, or actually in the pre-Reformation faith traditions, is always understood literally. I mean, it's understood in some sense, you know, beyond literally, but it's also understood literally that there is literally a cloud of witnesses surrounding us cheering us on, hoping that we do well, hoping that we maintain the faith, observe the faith, cling to the faith,
Mm-hmm.
who are available for intercession. And so, very literally, we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. In the Protestant faith traditions, it's simply symbolic. And I
Father
don't know.
John, Father John Ricardo um, gave a description like in during Mass. He says, it's like we're in a stadium and we're the ones that are doing the race, and in the stand are all the saints and souls that have gone before us, and they're all
Right,
cheering us on.
right.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what the author is saying.
Yeah.
And he's using and here he's using the image of a race,
Mm-hmm.
of a long distance race, like a mile or, however
Cross
many
country.
meters, or
Yeah.
marathon, or, yeah, not a sprint.
Mhm.
And the stadium is packed with
Mhm.
witnesses who are just cheering us on to the finish line.
Martyrs. Yeah.
And so the heroes of the Old Testament, but also of the New Testament, the martyrs,
Mm-hmm.
and all of those who have uh, have been proven worthy. So that's to be understood very literally. And I mean, it's not merely that it is to be understood very literally; it's literally true.
Mhm.
And so I have no idea what this is supposed to mean if it's understood symbolically. Some of this section, and especially the notion of the race enduring and fixing one's eyes, may well come from Fourth Maccabees,
Mm-hmm.
chapter 17. So it's Fourth Maccabees that's in an appendix to the Orthodox and Russian Orthodox Bibles, and is a book of the Bible in the Georgian Orthodox Bible. So in Second Maccabees, there's the mother with her 7 sons. Does everyone remember?
No, it's like they want to die, like each one of them die, and then
Right.
like
Yeah,
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Each one of them refused to um, renounce Judaism, and so they were martyred.
Mm-hmm.
And the final one spoke to his mother and sort of something like asked her whether um, she would be very hurt if he preferred death. And she said, no, death is the best thing for us. And then she was martyred after her 7 sons died. So that there's a continuation of that in Fourth Maccabees. Um, after the mother and her 7 sons were martyred. And the writer writes, what would be an appropriate message that could be carved on their tomb to remind our nation's people? Perhaps these words: here lie buried an old priest, that's Eleazar, who refused to eat pork and was martyred, an old woman, and 7 children because of the violence of a tyrant who wished to destroy the Hebrew way of life. They won justice for their nation by fixing their eyes on God and enduring torture to the point of death. The competition in which they were engaged was truly divine. Moral character itself handed out awards that day, having proved their worth through their endurance. Victory brought immortality through an endless life. Eleazar was the first competitor. The mother of the 7 children and the brothers competed also. The tyrant was the opponent, and the world and the human race were the audience. Respect for God won the day and crowned its champions. Who wasn't amazed at the athletes who were competing in the name of the divine law? who wasn't astonished? And that expression, fixing their eyes on, is the same as in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Paul also uses that metaphor of running the race. There's a mystery in the sense of there's an external appearance and a deeper internal reality, or a deeper reality, a superficial reality and a deeper reality.
Laying aside every weight and sin, which clings so closely, is just all the things that we do that are not leading us toward God, but away. The burdens we put on ourselves make it harder to run. But I don't think that's what you're talking about.
Well, it's partly that on the surface, Christian life is difficult, and there's the threat of martyrdom from which we should shrink back. The reality is that Christian life is like an athletic contest in which we have an enormous number of witnesses who are cheering us on and trying to support us to get to the finish line.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing here is that the witnesses are active participants. We're not doing this alone. And commenting on this, Chrysostom said, as in all arts and games, we impress the art upon our mind by looking to our masters, receiving certain rules through our sight. So here also, if we wish to run and to learn to run well, let us look to Christ, even to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. What is this? He has put the faith within us. You put the beginning into us. You will also put on the end. So let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, and let us run with perseverance. What is let us lay aside every weight and sin that clings so close, which clings so closely?
Well, in our Bible, it says to carry a burden while running slows the runner. As we run toward eternal life, we must drop any burdens that hampers our growth in holiness, such as sinful habits and excessive and inordinate attachments.
Mm-hmm.
Attachments to things and money and people, even.
So the imagery is continue. So he continues the imagery of the race throughout here. So this is more of the imagery of the race. Runners would run nude so that their clothes wouldn't be an obstacle. And I guess especially you would enter the arena with like a robe. So robes are very, what is it called? Heavy, but they also if they flap, they also
they're like sails the wrong way.
Right. They become like sails. So they'll hold you back in a significant way. So if you get rid of your robe and have no clothes and run, then you can run the race efficiently. So he's saying to get rid of that stuff.
Mm-hmm. The sin of turning away from, or the burden of turning away from faith because of cultural pressure or persecution.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we've broadened. I think we've broadened the original meaning to don't let money, whatever, don't let possessions, don't let this, don't let that, don't let whatever. But I think within his original context, he doesn't mean any of those things. In his original context, what he means is the pressure to abandon Jesus, the threat of persecution, the peer pressure from non-Christian Jews to abandon the faith. And so he talks about aside every weight and sin that clings so closely. So I think his argument is that the weight, if you allow the weight to cling to you, leads to sin.
Mhm.
And that sin, he really is predominantly concerned with one sin, which is apostasy.
Hmm.
So that sin leads you to abandon Christ, which is an act of apostasy. That isn't to say that the more modern interpretation or extension of his interpretation isn't a correct one. We indeed should cast aside anything that gets in the way of our running the race and of following Christ. That word, by the way, clings so closely is made up by the author
Mhm.
and doesn't actually exist in classical Greek.
Really?
Yeah,
Mhm.
he's made up throughout a number of words from root words. So he's
Mhm.
combined roots together to create another word. If
I guess they didn't have polyester then.
yeah, if anyone, well, it's probably badly translated, but if anyone has read Chekhov, he does that extensively. He makes up new Russian words by
Really? Wow.
adding prefixes and suffixes. They're usually lost in the translation because uh, there's no equivalent. It's a made up word in Russian, and there's no equivalent word anyway in English, and so it becomes difficult to translate. But if you know Russian, his language is just incredibly beautiful, and the sort of symbolism and the his depiction of behavior and interactions of people is really 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 sort of mind-boggling. And so one view is apostasy, and the more modern view is anything that keeps us from running. And so looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. So notice here he uses Jesus and not Christ.
Mhm.
He's talking about Jesus as he's focusing on his humanity. And because he's focusing on his humanity, we can be just like Jesus. So what did he do? Who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross.
I have a little note here from before, I guess before the summer. Matthew 13:44, where the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field which a man found and covered up. And then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field.
Uh-huh.
So his joy was that treasure.
Mm-hmm.
And for Christ, well, for Jesus, the joy that was set before him endured the cross, which is how we have all been having the ability to be set free of our sins. He redeemed you.
Mm-hmm. And so the joy is salvation.
Yeah.
But the joy is also I mean, there are a couple of interpretations of joy, which we'll get to in a moment, but the joy is the ability to look beyond the immediate circumstance to see something greater. And so that's what Christ did, or Jesus did, looking beyond
The burdens.
the humiliation, the shame, the suffering, the pain, the horrible, cruel death on the cross, to focus on what the result was going to be, that salvation would come, that our relationship with God was perfected, that we could be made perfect to stand before God.
Mm.
So similarly, that's what the martyrs did. They looked beyond the suffering. They looked beyond the pain that was inflicted on them. They looked beyond all of that to accept their martyrdom, to bless their persecutors and murderers, and to focus on what would be the result of their martyrdom, which profoundly 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 touched others, including their persecutors.
Mhm.
So it didn't happen at once. It wasn't an immediate process, but that's one of the things that had a huge impact in growing the faith, along with the behavior of Christians, who during epidemics, when everyone was fleeing, didn't flee. They stayed and took care of the sick and dying, including people they didn't know, or who there was the practice of exposing babies, especially daughters, if you didn't want them, or if they were uh, handicapped, you let them out, put them outside to die. And Christians collected those babies. They raised them.
Mm.
So they set an example. And, those examples were profoundly touched people because those behaviors were counterintuitive, and especially when you're being martyred, you should curse, you should, wish hell upon or whatever, any other kind of equivalent is upon your persecutors. And, they didn't do that. So that, was profoundly disturbing. People, like a hangman or whatever, executioner expects to be cursed, right? That's part of the job. You don't expect people are going to bless you as you kill them. That's disturbing. To fix our eyes upon the literal translation is actually look away from the immediate surroundings to something else. So look away from the immediate surrounding. That fixing eyes upon is also in verse 26 of chapter 11. The author talks about how Moses fixed his attention upon the reward. But since he's the perfecter of faith, Jesus is the focus of the race. Jesus is at the finish line. Jesus is both the culmination of faith and the supreme example of faith. So he's unlike the heroes of the Old Testament. And so like them. There's continuity. He endured hardship, he endured trials, he endured suffering, he endured persecution and death. Unlike them, he completed the course and he received what had been promised. And he was made perfect so that we could be made perfect. So his faith was qualitatively different from those of the heroes of the faith. So, in fixing our eyes upon Jesus, the author is saying we also should be prepared to share through faith active opposition and suffering. So, the author and perfecter of our faith, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, the leader and perfecter of our faith, those are all various translations. Jesus, who leads us in our faith and brings it to completion. The champion in the exercise of faith and the one who brought it to complete expression. Perfecter here is a word made up.
Okay.
What does that all mean? What does the phrase mean?
He was the first example, the best example,
Mm-hmm.
perfecter, supreme example of our faith. The pioneer is one who kind of trailblazes for the rest to follow.
Mm-hmm. Remember earlier in chapter 2, verse 10, he talks about Jesus being the pioneer of their salvation.
Mm-hmm. So showing us the way.
And also at one point, he talks about Jesus being the forerunner. Does everyone remember that? Forerunner who has gone before us.
Mm-hmm.
Leader, author, pioneer.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that he's the first one or that faith didn't exist before him. It's that he reached the goal of faith, which is perfection. The Old Testament heroes did not. The ability to be in the presence of God, the ability to stand before God. And because Jesus achieved perfection, he set an example that we can follow. So in that way, he's the author, he's the leader, he's the pioneer, so that we also can be made perfect. The author and perfecter, or however the first word is translated, tends to convey an image of a beginning and an end, right? The author, the finisher. That actually is that grammatical construct of beginning and end is used in a number of places previously by the author. So it suggests that Jesus is, the initiator and the head of us, a rank and file, and that he also brings the faith along with us to its ultimate expression. So that he's the first who expressed unqualified obedience to God's will, as opposed to others who died without receiving the promises. Jesus brought faith to its whole triumphant conclusion so we can receive the promises, and also so that the Old Testament heroes and the people of the Old Testament can receive the promises. But he endured the cross, despising its shame, or scorning its shame. What is the significance? That's the only time the cross is mentioned in Hebrews. What is the significance of that?
Well, it was reserved for those like the vilest of the offenders or the worst of the offenders
Mm-hmm.
by having been put on the cross. It was showing that he was among the worst ever.
Mm-hmm. A convicted criminal worthy of death.
Yeah, not just a convicted criminal, but one of the worst convicted criminals. They didn't do it to all criminals.
No. And an example for others. I mean, you know, this is very public. You're left out in the
Yeah.
open air as an example. If you behave like this evil criminal, this is what's going to happen to you.
Mhm.
Or if you cross the Roman state, this is what's going to happen to you. Crossing the Roman state is, of course, the worst of crimes.
Mhm.
But also remember that both Hellenistic society and Hebrew society, Mediterranean society in general, those are societies of culture and shame, of honor and shame, rather. You know, so an appearance of honor is very important, and appearance of shame is very shameful. It's humiliating. It's discrediting. It um, allowing yourself to be shamed or being in a position where you're shamed points to your own extreme moral weakness and your lack of honor in a society based on honor. So he despised or he scorned the shame. Why is that significant?
That's an earthly thing. He put it aside. That was a cultural, but he was above that actually.
Uh-huh. He was above that, and what else?
He was looking to something more important.
Uh-huh. He was. What else? I mean, why is the author saying this here? He could just skip it.
Oh,
He
because
endured.
the people who are following him may be coming up against that same thing. They were being shamed for being Christians.
Exactly right. 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 He's saying don't give in to the shame.